Well, we can't hear you very well. Maybe that's not necessary at this point, but.
Short one.
I don't know. We gotta get back to this. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Good evening and welcome to the Litchfield Springs public hearing for February 3rd, 2020. The purposes of the public hearing are to receive public comments on the board of Litchfield Springs Community Development League and to discuss possible submission of one or more community development block grant (CDBG) applications for the 2020 program year, including applications to certain infrastructure projects that will involve providing treated water to a number of residences in the towns of Litchfield and Springfield currently receiving raw water from the village. For the new main and pump station to be repaired to the existing main at an estimated cost of $1,201,331. Eligible local government may be awarded up to $1,250,000 in grant funding under the CDBG 2020 program for qualifying public infrastructure projects. The CDBG program is administered by the New York State Office of Community Renewal, OCR, and may make available to eligible local governments approximately $20 million in total federal funds for the 2020 program year for housing, economic development, public facilities, public infrastructure, and planning activities, with the principal purpose of benefiting low and moderate income persons. This hearing will provide further information about the CDBG program and will allow for citizen participation in the development of any proposed grant application and or provide technical assistance to develop alternate proposals. Comments on the CDBG program or proposed projects will be this time. The hearing will be conducted pursuant to section 570.486 of Part 1 of the CFR and in compliance with requirements of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974 as amended. Members of the public may participate in the public hearing via Zoom by entering the code on at the village website. Minutes of the hearing will be transcribed and later in the village website. Village of Litchfield-New-York.com. With that, I believe our attorney Michelle Kennedy is on. Michelle, do you want to address this hearing at all? All right, well,
Wait a minute.
Receive any comment at this time?
Hang on one second.
I hope you people don't think we can understand you.
It's almost unintelligible.
Hello, this is Michelle Kennedy.
Yes.
Ms. Smith and Ms. Stone, we apologize for some of the audio issues. I understand that you may have some difficulty hearing, and I realize that there may be some others who are experiencing the same difficulty. Can you hear me better at this point than the speakers in the room?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So there was an introductory paragraph that was read by the mayor that gives an overview of the CDBG program and the grant opportunity that is presented to the village. There's a grant opportunity for approximately $1,250,000 that has the potential to provide treated water in place of the raw water lines that are currently servicing 6 properties outside of the village in the towns of Springfield and Richfield. And the purpose of this public hearing is to receive your feedback. And I'm not just directing this to the 2 speakers that I named, but I understood they were having some audio concerns. But certainly anyone who's participating this evening in the public hearing and anyone who may...
It's as though you're underwater, talking underwater. What does the new main and power and pump station, where would that be located?
On village property. And
not up by the lake.
The new main is intended to be laid within the right-of-way of a roadway, so it's not intended to be on private property. And it could not be without easements granted. But the intention at this early stage, if the village is awarded the grant funds, is to lay the main within the right-of-way or public roadway, not on private property.
And how would that affect the 6 people who are at this point on the line?
Right, so the intention would be to have distribution lines. Currently you have lateral lines that serve the raw water to your property. So in those lateral lines, they would be replaced. And this grant is unique in that respect, as it does cover lateral lines. Many of the grants would not. And so this is a unique opportunity where we could have both the main as well as the lateral lines covered.
We lost you on some of that. So you'll be replacing the lines for those 6 properties. You would be replacing the line in general, and the lines to the 6 properties. Would you still provide water?
Yes, so the intention is rather than raw water, we would come into compliance with Department of Health regulations and provide treated water.
But if the treatment plant, if the pump station is beyond the properties, what's the difference?
So right now...
When you talk lateral...
Sure, so
Go ahead.
Right now you have a transmission line that runs from the reservoir to the treatment plant. And my understanding, I'm not the engineering expert, but my basic understanding is that the distribution lines run from that line that's running from reservoir to treatment plant, and along the way serve raw water to the subject properties.
Yes.
The intention would be to have another line that runs from the treatment plant, and the line from the treatment plant would then have lateral lines instead, which would serve treated water to your properties.
Wouldn't that be running the water backwards?
Correct. So that is the way, again, I'm not the engineering expert, but that is the way that I envision this, which is you're going in the opposite direction because it has to come from the treatment plant.
How does it?
So you'd have to run new lines to all the properties.
That's right, and that's why it's such an expensive project, and without the grant, it's really cost prohibitive for the village.
Sure.
You know, it's a small number of properties to serve, but yet, you know, it's a fairly expensive project.
But how would they expect to pump that water back up to us after it went down to the treatment plant?
Right, so I understand.
That's the new pump station.
I understand from the engineer that there will be a new pump station on village property.
Where?
again, that would be the parcel that, when I look at the map, I think that there's a parcel that's already owned by the village, that is close, that's either right inside the village line or closer to it, and that would be the parcel, most likely where the pump station would be located.
Would it be located on the property of the existing treatment plant?
Robin, are you able to say in relation to the treatment plant? I'm not sure where the treatment plant lies in relation to your properties.
It's by the state trooper barracks up here.
Okay.
It's right by me. That's why I know where it is. The
So
treatment plant is on this hill where the state trooper barracks is.
Right. So my understanding is that the pump station then would also be located in that same vicinity. Again, I can say with confidence on village property, because that question was directly asked of the engineer, and he made it clear at the last meeting that the pump station would be on the village property.
And then you pump the water back to us at, would it still be at no expense to us?
So the information that I reviewed with respect to the chains of title, and this is somewhat limited because, again, our funding has been very limited to this point.
Sure.
But the information that I currently have, without having a full title abstract of each property, indicates that many of the properties, the deeds do read that water is to be supplied without charge. Now, I say that with the caveat that we would be bound by that language in the deeds. However,
Yes.
if the
Yes.
nature or intensity of the use changes. So let's say right now you have a family residence as opposed to, a commercial or industrial operation. Generally, those rights are read consistent with the use at the time of the right. So historically, these properties have been residential or agricultural properties, and provided that they didn't change in terms of, again, the nature or intensity of the use, then that language would be binding. For the village, I will say the village's water rent schedule currently, let's say that there were further determination that a chain of title did not include that language. If that is the case, the maximum liability that you would be exposed to would be the water rent for an outside user in the village. And currently, the highest category for that is if you were to use over 7,000 gallons, that's charged at a rate of approximately $16. That is subject to change by resolution of the board. But
so they are trying to change that. That for these 6 properties or 8 properties has been a good factor, that we have not had to pay, that the way it was written originally said free water.
So it's not that the village is trying to change anything. The village always evaluates their water rents on an annual basis for the entire village as well as outside users. Again, if your deeds contain the language that says without charge, again, provided that the intensity and the nature of the use does not change, we would be bound by that language for these particular properties. That does not mean for every property that does not have that language in their deed that may lie along the main and later exercise an option if it becomes available to tap into the main.
Mm-hmm. I've lived here 40 years, and Judy's lived here 50. And every time we get a new manager or a new mayor or a new supervisor, we go through this. And we have been bullied and we have been intimidated. And so we are, I can say, I think probably speaking for most of us, we are very leery of anything that is projected. We've had to get lawyers at times to hold to what the case law dictated. And so, you'd have to really do a convincing job on me before I would think that might be a better situation than I'm in now. Most people have some sort of water treatment plants on their own systems to filter to whatever. And I understand your liability. I do understand some of that, but you must understand also the history. There's been history of people pushing and bullying and getting people off the line, and we're very distrustful.
I certainly,
you've really got to play up this, and it sounds fine, but you've got to play it up and do a little more than just give me a paper and say, oh, give me your financial things. Well, I'm not going to do it until I know more about what the ramification is for each one of our owners. And if you're saying, okay, well, we're going to take that free water away, maybe, and they're going to rise up. They're going to rise up. If we have to get a lawyer, we get a lawyer. Maybe we don't understand the whole thing, but you have to understand what's gone on for the last 40 or 50 years. This is at least the fourth time in my history that this has been challenged. They were going to cut us off from water. They were going to do this and do that, and bully and intimidate. And as I say, we had to get a lawyer. And if we do have to get one this time, we will. But I don't understand from all of this the ramification to each one of these homeowners for their water supply.
So if I may, this is, of course, the purpose of the public hearing. And, I will certainly do my best to answer your questions most directly. But it is a holistic situation that I think the village has at least taken the preliminary steps to consider, because it's in everyone's best interest. And it's
well, that's what you have to prove.
Right.
Is that it's in my best interest, it's in Judy's best interest to do it this way. And it sounds fine, but I want to know what ramification is.
Sure. So let me begin with the options before the village, and certainly stop me if you have questions. And I again invite anyone who's participating in the public hearing to do the same. I don't want to direct this to any particular participant, but the village received, and I realize that this has been ongoing for decades, but I think from a governmental perspective, serving of raw water has become a much more serious issue that has rightfully garnered more public attention. And so more recently, in the last quarter of 2020, the village received findings of violation from the New York State Department of Health, as well as a stipulation. And what the New York State Department of Health said was that the village had very strict deadlines to come into compliance and to begin correcting this issue, no longer serving raw water to these residences, or the village would imminently face fines that, of course, do not accomplish anything other than finding the village, but don't solve the problem. And so the CDBG opportunity came to our attention in a few weeks into January, and it's the best grant opportunity that we've seen. There are others that, for instance, New York State environmental facilities offer, but with respect to the New York State environmental facilities, currently grants are not being offered, and historically, when they have been offered, they are usually at approximately 30% of the total project cost. This is the only grant of which we are aware that would cover the entire project cost if we're awarded the grant, which certainly lifts the burden from the village and potentially also from residents, dependent upon what the circumstances may be. So as I said, it's a holistic solution from that perspective in terms of the planning and the construction, alleviating the cost entirely, and no fiscal match is required of the village. So if we receive the full amount of the grant, the $1,250,000, it would cover the project in its entirety. I think that alone is, there are so few properties that are involved at this point. We're talking about 6 properties. And if the village's maximum gain is potentially $16 every quarter of a year, that and that would be our maximum gain, that pales in comparison to the fines or the construction costs that we could otherwise incur without this grant. As I said, the majority of deeds that I have seen do include the language that say without charge. And again, so long as you're not, subdividing your property and then all of a sudden there's a shopping mall on the property instead of a
Yes, yes.
house, we're still in that classification that I said, where the nature and intensity of use is not changing, and thus the language would apply in the deeds without charge. And I think most of you fall in that category. It's just, frankly, the village has not had the means to go back and do title searches over the last 100 years, which is how far back this title history runs for
Yes.
each 6 properties. And so we're operating with the documentation that's been provided to us in the past by former council to the village, that's been within the water superintendent's files. And that documentation, again, seems to consistently show this clause without charge. And so I do feel confident saying to you, and I think, yes, the village may be walking away from $16, every quarter, but again, that pales in comparison to the potential cost of the project, which is $1,201,331. So,
Mhm.
it's a small give for the village in return for trying to move this grant application forward. And our possibilities, we do not have the option under the New York State Department of Health violation to simply leave the lines as they are. It's just simply, unless the village intends to incur continuing violation charges and possibly face other penalties, it is not an option for us just to leave this as is. So those are the circumstances that we face. And, I understand the reluctance to complete the surveys that were circulated to the 6 subject properties. Unfortunately, the grant requirement is that we have to have 100% participation with the surveys. And, certainly we would prefer that that's not a requirement, but it is, in order to even preliminarily file the grant application. So without those surveys, this is a non-possibility. So the surveys are extraordinarily important.
Understandably, I understand that, but you can understand. We get a FedEx from somebody I don't even know and saying, "Give me all your financial data," and I don't do that for anybody.
Well,
And I don't know who this management group is, and I don't know the ramification of the project. So, your expectation is a little high without the explanations.
Sure. So the form that you were sent, I just want to be clear, because I don't want to give an impression of something that's not. It's not a fair characterization. So you were sent 2 pages, and additionally, which was the legal notice for the public hearing. So a total of 3 pages in the FedEx package. And again,
Yes.
the FedEx was intended purely to ensure timely delivery to you. It wasn't intended to in any way, cause concern, but mainly to just make sure that you received in a timely fashion, because we are working on a very tight timing deadline, that you received the public hearing notice as well as the 2-page survey. The 2-page survey included a cover page, which explained that the survey would remain confidential, meaning that identifying information that's provided on page 1 is separated from page 2.
Who guarantees that for me?
That was the format that we were told to follow by CDBG. And it is one of the accepted forms that they use for all of these projects. And the firm that it's coming from is the engineering firm. And certainly if you'd feel more comfortable returning it directly to the village, that's fine. If you don't feel comfortable for it to go to the engineering firm, it would be perfectly acceptable from our standpoint to return to the village clerk instead. But the 2 pages will be separated.
No, I would feel comfortable going to the management firm and asking a few questions, and asking. See, our concern is going to be, what is the result of this for us? I understand the result of it for you. I understand the need. I understand the pressure you're under. I understand that. But what you're not really reassuring me of the ramification for each of the 6 users.
Right. So what I can say with confidence is that if we're successful in the application, that there would be no cost to you in terms of the construction, that at the end of the day you would receive treated water rather than raw water, and that your greatest potential cost exposure, and I say this lightly because I don't think for these 6 properties that there will be any cost exposure, but your greatest potential liability is that you may have to pay approximately $16 every 3 months for treated water, and that is your greatest potential liability. Again, if your deed says, when most of them see language without charge, that would be honored. The alternative that we're in, and it's not intended in any way to be intimidating, but is the Department of Health will not allow the status quo to remain. So if we're unsuccessful, we will have no choice other than to approach a court, most likely, and have the court decide what is the alternative. And
Mm-hmm.
will most likely be the option of compensating you in some way for the water rights that currently exist and terminating those water rights. It could be in the form of providing for a private well on the property, or it could be in the more drastic form of simply giving notice and severing the line. And I don't mean any of that to sound intimidating. I'm just telling you that our range of options does not include
We've been through it before. We have been through it before.
records. I know.
We have gotten a lawyer before.
Right. And I don't know if this has been tried before, which is applying for the grant monies and Department of Health.
I think it's a good idea. It's a very good idea as far as my perspective on it, and that might solve everyone's problem. I think that to get the 6 owners on board, you might have to really tell them that their case law of free water is still going to exist.
And again, I mean, from the village's perspective, I realize that there's some reluctance on the village side in terms of the cost, but most of the village stands to gain, again, would be those quarterly rents that are nominal in comparison to the cost and the potential cost of having to finance this project if we do not receive a grant. So it very much,
sure.
It does behoove the village, to come to terms with the residents, because our interests, we're all, as I said at the beginning, we are all benefited if this grant can be received. It solves the problem. And I do feel confident in stating that.
Well, I have a question.
Sure.
A couple of years ago, we had a leak, and my property was all dug up, and it's never been the same since. Some little bushes were broken and died and other things. But what happens to all the money that went into this new line that crosses my property, that goes from Allen's Lake Road all the way down to the reservoir?
I'm just, if you can clarify with respect to the question, when you say the new line, is it the line
It's a brand new line they put in a couple of years ago, maybe 3.
Okay, so a new line was put in 3 years ago, and that's something I can have the engineer check into. I wasn't aware that there was a relatively new line that was put in.
Yes, and there's a shut-off in my yard.
Okay. And so that would be, okay, so if there's a shut-off in your yard, then that is most likely what I referred to before as the lateral line. Okay. And so it may be that in that case, if the lateral line is relatively new, perhaps you wouldn't need a new lateral line. In other words, if it's not, aged and deteriorating, perhaps we could connect that to the new. Oh, I
Well,
would.
the old line was, to the engineer's amazement, the old line was perfectly clean all across the road and from way up the road. It only had developed a leak in my yard. And so they ended up putting in an entire new line all the way from the reservoir out to the road, across my whole property here. That cost the village quite a lot of money.
Can you guys hear me?
Mr. Cohn,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Okay. Hi, Judy. How are you? It's Joe.
Hi. How are you?
Not too bad. What she's referring to is the raw water line. There was a leak in the raw water line right behind her house that goes into the reservoir.
Okay. And so it was replaced, is that?
It was just a section that was bad. It had a hole in it, and they replaced it a couple years ago.
Yeah, but it was a long section, Joe.
Yeah, well, what she's talking about is you'd have the raw water line still going to the plant, and what they would do is run a new line from the plant back out towards Allen's Lake for all those houses on the raw water line. It'd be a completely different line. You wouldn't be getting rid of that old one.
So they're going to put a new line into every house?
Yes.
That's part of the cost?
Yes.
And I can just echo that. That is my understanding as well. And I did hear you say in the beginning that you were somewhat concerned with the restoration of the property. It seemed as though you were upset with perhaps that the property wasn't left in good order. Is that correct?
Well, it's never been the same, no. And I didn't want to make a fuss because I've lived here for 51 years, and but I have a little building down there that got waterlogged from the leak, and it tipped over, and we spent many hours and a lot of work to right that building back up and fix it.
Well, certainly, Ms. Stone, I can say that the engineer will be on site, and as part of the planning,
I'm sorry, I'm not catching you.
I don't know if it's our phones or your phone, but there's a great deal of interference.
Okay, it's perhaps just because but I'll try to speak a little bit louder if that's better. We'll definitely.
You sound like you're gurgling in the lake.
We'll definitely raise your concern, Ms. Stone, with the engineer that the restoration of the property is extremely important to you. Robin, did you want to ask?
For some time we had a fairly good connection, but now we're back to something strange.
Yeah.
Can you hear the old office, please?
If you're asking us questions, we can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Can you see us?
I can now hear you, Robin and Stone. Are there others, while we're with the audio conference, are there others on the line who also wish to make comments?
I don't know if anybody else is doing it on Zoom.
I can't hear you.
Brian or Jason, Dick, are you on the line? We can't, I don't hear anything now.
I don't either. I can only hear you, Judy.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Joe, Carolee, and Judy, I can hear you all fine. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Okay, so Michelle, you're getting like interference every once in a while, like you come in and out all of a sudden randomly. Like you were fine for quite a while.
Okay, let me
Yes.
see. Is that any better?
I guess we
Yes,
can find
Right
out.
now, yes.
Right at this moment, it's good.
Okay, I'll try not
But
to.
then it
Okay. Okay.
now there it goes.
Oh, it goes again.
Yep. Kind of almost
stop.
sounds like someone's like scratching a record or something.
Yeah, I don't actually think that it's on my end. I'm not sure if
Okay.
it's on another.
You know, a landline you could use?
I don't think I can call into the Zoom via the landline, Robin.
Okay.
But I can hear you perfectly now.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
So just to the point that I made before, as I said, I do understand the reluctance with respect to the surveys. But again, without the surveys being returned, then the grant is just simply an impossibility. We cannot qualify because there is such a small group of people. They are requiring that this 100%.
Lost you again.
I'm not sure what it is. Robin, are they able to
We aren't hearing you.
I can't hear anything besides Judy and I'm sorry, I didn't catch who the other person is.
Dale, yeah, I think that's all the problem. Dale, you may have to mute them occasionally.
Yeah, I was just trying that.
Okay, so Joe, I think you can hear us right now. I think it's this line, the 2112, that
Okay.
the static.
Yeah,
maybe
it seems to have stopped now at the
right.
moment.
So what we'll have to do is we'll have to periodically check. Is that would be Carolee on that line?
Okay.
So we're
Yep.
going to have to periodically check the Carolee. I think she can probably hear us right now, but that she may not have further comments. But I think the static is coming from that line.
I just muted.
Okay. Okay.
But I can't get Barb to unmute herself.
You might not want to.
Oh, she
Maybe it might be better right now to keep anyone on mute. Joe, did you have other comments or questions? Because I know it looked like you had joined us perhaps a little bit into the public hearing.
Yes, I'm actually from the DPW. I don't know if you knew that.
Okay.
My question was why are we not going for wells before going for this very big expensive project?
Sure. So we discussed this at length, and I'll probably try to keep this a little bit brief, but if it requires greater explanation, then please let me know. So as Carolee and Judy were pointing out, this issue has been ongoing for decades, and I can actually say that it's been ongoing for a century, and there's no exaggeration when I say that. But of course, for the Department of Health, raw water issues they've really come to the forefront. Communities have been sickened by raw water, and it's simply an important issue. So here, under our circumstances, what that perhaps the fact that greater emphasis has been placed on this issue, I would say that's a more recent development. What hasn't changed is this. And when you look at, Judy and Carolee were referring to this history very broadly, but what has happened over the years is the village has tried to address this through various means. And one of the means has been to consider severing the raw water lines and replacing the source of water with other means, potentially wells. And when the prior speaker said that they've hired attorneys, I can't say that they spoke to, if wells were proposed, what was their response. But what they are speaking to is that within their deeds, there are water rights. And that differentiates this situation from other situations where the water rights are not deeded. And so what happened over the last century, between the late 19th century and early 20th century, was when the village approached landowners to purchase a parcel for village property, probably for the water treatment plant, and then also to run the water line from the reservoir to the treatment plant. They entered into negotiations and eventually deals that were reflected in the deeds with the landowners. And what the landowners, some of them negotiated for, not everyone, but what some of them negotiated for, and I assume it is now the same land that's occupied by the current subject 6 properties, was to have water rights in place of more money for the easement rights and for the parcel of land that was being purchased, probably for that water treatment plant. And so what they said was, instead of taking, and I'm just using this very broadly, but instead of taking $500, we'll take $250. We'll give you easement rights, village, to run your water line. But in return, you have to guarantee that you will continue to, or that you will supply water, not continue, but you will supply water to our properties without charge. Because instead of accepting 500, we're agreeing right now to take 250. And we're placing a value on the water rights that you will supply to us without charge. There was a case, and it's rather remarkable, actually, it's an interesting piece of Richfield Springs history. There was a case that was pursued. It was appealed all the way up to the New York State Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals affirmed the decision of the appellate division, the 3rd appellate division, which is the intermediary court. And the intermediary court said that the water rights were consideration for, in this case, it was the purchase of the village parcel. And as a result, they run in perpetuity with the land. And so it's those rights, when the landowners are saying that they will stand up and enforce their rights, it's those rights within the deeds that they're enforcing. And so it is not, unlike a situation where you do not have deeded water rights, you cannot say that the water well is a perfect replacement for the infrastructure and water lines that they're entitled to. And simply because the village is coming under heightened regulation does not change their deeded water rights. And so that's the situation we're in. And we spoke specifically with the Department of Health about that situation. And it is a different situation than what they commonly would more commonly confront, which is the situation where there's no deeded water rights. There's simply a raw water line. And what the Department of Health, what they expect under those circumstances is that you give notice and the line simply severed and you do not continue to serve raw water. So here it's because of the deeded water rights that we're in the situation that we can't just simply say to the owners, we're going to replace your deeded water rights and the right to a supply of water through these lines with a water well. It's not apples to apples.
So that means if we don't get the grant, what are we going to do then?
So then I think, just as I told Judy and Carolee, I think that we would have to defer to a court's decision. So, we would have to go to a court, and it's not intended to be adversarial, but I think we would have to approach the court for a declaratory judgment. In the past, what they faced was what was called a condemnation proceeding, meaning that and this was in 2003, the condemnation proceeding that was brought by the village in 2003, and the respondents were these same property owners. The attempt was to simply condemn the water rights. And I'll tell you that the information that's available through the court's records indicates that the case was just simply dismissed without a decision nor an order. So once again, it suggests to us that the case was not proceeding in anyone's favor because neither side decided to pursue it. So we're facing a very difficult situation. And when we had the conversation with the Department of Health, they were unable to name another situation that has this similarity to ours, where there are deeded water rights. That is the complicating factor here.
Okay, so what if they don't want treated water? What if they'd rather have a well? Is there a way that we could make it work that way?
We could certainly enter into a settlement agreement with any landowner under those circumstances, and that may be a cost savings, but our general understanding is that that is not the preference of the group. Keep in mind that the infrastructure, it does add value to the land because you have more potential in terms of the development of that land if you have water lines running to the land.
So we've gone and asked every single homeowner on that raw water line
No.
what they'd rather have.
So I said at the very beginning that, we're trying to approach this in a holistic manner and come up with a holistic solution. And despite the number of beneficiaries of this project, we're in a rural setting. So we're not going to have a population that's going to benefit, that it will include scores of people. It is going to be a more sparsely populated group. But the fact that there is a findings of violation and a stipulation actually increases our chances of qualifying for this grant. And the grant has the potential of covering the entire project, which alleviates the cost for the village, and it gives the maximum benefit to the landowners. So it's the first approach that we're taking, with the idea that this benefits everyone if the grant is granted. But it is, I can say that again, the Department of Health was unable to name any other community that faces this issue that we're facing and the complicating factors that we're facing. So, it is for that reason, we may not tilt the scales in terms of the number of people we're benefiting, but in terms of the severity of the issue and the public need, it would be very high on the list.
So is this grant, I didn't exactly hear what the grant was for. Is it just for general infrastructure or specific infrastructure?
No, so it includes 3 categories: public facilities, public infrastructure, and planning activities. We would fall under the public infrastructure category. And because there is, one of the reasons that this project was zeroed in on versus others is that I know this seems counterintuitive, but you actually receive much greater points for your grant application if there is an administrative violation that's been issued. So because we actually have a findings of violation and we're under a stipulation, this application has a higher likelihood of receiving grant funding than another that is not subject to a similar administrative order.
Okay. How long before you can apply for the grant again.
Right. So that's why, as I stressed the surveys, and one of the reasons we are under a time pressure, the application is due by March 5th. And of course, the engineer needs time to devise the plans. And we need some time to prepare the application. We are at every meeting marching forward with the village. We intend to continue to make progress. There will be resolutions that the village will have to pass, but we are, there's a time crunch, it's undeniable. And if the surveys do not come in, as I said, there's no possibility whatsoever of this grant.
Okay. So generally, I mean, obviously they need to get clean water, something other than the raw water, because that definitely isn't something that I'd want to drink. But I also feel like if there was a better way to not spend that much money, so we could, like, say, use the grant for other things in the village, I feel like it'd be more beneficial, because otherwise it sounds like this project would cost the village a lot of money, even though you might not have to pay for that project. I mean, it's taking away a grant that we could potentially use on many other water lines in the village, along with the upkeep of that water line that goes, I don't know, isn't it like 2-3 miles out of the village? And when you have to maintain that long of a water line and you have to find out where a break is, I mean,
Right.
that can be a big ordeal.
It can be. And so, Joe, much of my background and experience is in water and sewer projects. I commonly serve as bond counsel to a number of municipalities. And so I can tell you from experience that you're absolutely correct that often what happens is that we think we have a perfect solution, and then addressing one problem can often identify another problem. And if, again, from a grant perspective, this grant is not a one-time, it's not a one-time opportunity. So the CDBG funding, it usually there's at least an annual opportunity to apply for such grants. And so it certainly doesn't rule, by applying now for this particular project, it certainly would not rule out the possibility of other projects in the future. And that's true with respect to EFC funding as well. Generally, with respect to more comprehensive water and sewer funding, ordinarily what you would want to see is that there's been an engineering planning grant, that you have a more comprehensive study of the entire system, that they've identified within that engineering study the items that are up at the highest priority, and then the grant funding is applied for with respect to those items.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. So that going forward, I would certainly encourage the village board to continue to pursue CDBG and EFC grant opportunities, as well as others if they become available, USDA opportunities. But because I've explained to the village board that this timing for the CDBG grant also coincides with the timing for coming into compliance with the DOH stipulation. So the DOH stipulation says by April that we have to have engineering plans in place as to how this situation will be addressed, and they have to be forwarded to DOH for approval. So the intent is to use the village's resources to not only address the DOH stipulation, but also to gain funding for the project simultaneously, so that, again, there can be an exponential benefit to those efforts.
Well, I'm glad we will be able to apply for it again for other projects.
And certainly to the extent that the water and sewer superintendents and staff, to the extent that they can identify issues of concern, that would be extremely helpful, I think, to the village board going forward and naming priorities for grant opportunities. I think that it's in the village's best interest to be very aggressive in terms of applying for grants.
Okay.
I'm still here, but I don't know if Carol Lee lost you at some point. But in speaking to 2 or 3 people on the line. Part of the concern was the need for financial information from these properties.
And Judy, I do understand where you're coming from. You know, I think my reaction to the survey was much like your own, which is, you know, it was the same gut reaction of, I'm surprised that I have to ask people these questions in the survey. But again, every question that is listed on is a requirement of the grant.
Going funny now, see, when now we're going crazy again.
Carolee, if you can hear me, we'll add you back in just a minute, but I think that static is on your line. So we'll try to add you back in a minute, but to answer Judy's question, so Judy, believe me, it would have been our strong preference not to have to send surveys and not to ask any questions regarding income. But what the grant program wants to be assured of is that they are not subsidizing wealthy households. They want to be assured that this is serving, you know, average citizens that, you know, will benefit from the program, that they're not giving handouts to the wealthy. Basically, that's the basic idea behind their surveys. It's not to be used for any other purpose. This is a program for moderate to low income households, and they don't want it to benefit wealthy households.
Yeah. Well, I sort of understood that. I already returned mine. But I still wanted to hear everything that you had to say about it.
Well, I definitely appreciate your participation.
I will speak to a couple of others in hopes of encouraging them to send theirs in also.
Thank you.
Any chance right now? Mute everybody but her.
Carolee, if you can hear me, I think we're going to try to add you back in.
We're back to the static.
Yeah. I think that we may just have to encourage Carolee. She can certainly reach out to the village. She can reach out to Robin, and Robin, you can certainly share my contact information as well as the engineering firm's contact information. And we are accepting written comments through, and I just want to be sure that I give the exact date. It was through February 18th at 5:00 p.m. So any other comments can be submitted also through that date to the village clerk, February 18th at 5:00 p.m. And if you do have further concerns and questions, particularly regarding the survey, please do not hesitate to reach out, because as I've stressed throughout, the survey is important. It's essential, really, in order to be able to qualify to submit the grant application.
Deadline for those surveys that, you know,
I'm sorry, Robin, just.
The 3rd of March is deadline for the surveys, 5th of March.
So we sent in the 6 mailings that went out to the subject property owners, we asked that they return them by this Friday, and there were enclosed postage paid envelopes to do so, just to, again, to make the process as simple as possible. Those envelopes were going back to McManus Engineering. Again, if they'd rather send it to the village clerk, that's perfectly okay. We just want to make sure that it's either received by the village clerk or Miss McManus Engineering. That is not an absolute deadline, but the sooner we can get the surveys, as I said, we cannot apply without them. So I know that in an attempt to be conservative with utilizing village resources, you know, the engineering firm does not want to proceed expeditiously if we don't know for sure that we're going to get back the 6 surveys. So it is time sensitive in the sense that they will need a reasonable amount of time to complete what is a fairly lengthy application. And even as of Tuesday evening, because of the timing of the village board meetings, we have to proceed with the environmental review. It would be terrific to know that the surveys have come back, before we're proceeding with those motions. I think we will go ahead anyways to make sure that we're positioned to qualify if we do get all 6 surveys back, but it certainly would be helpful to have the surveys before then. So the sooner the better, but certainly don't send it because it's later than this Friday.
Okay. Is everybody on mute?
Mm-mm.
You ready?
No, just her.
Okay. So if there's anybody else that would like an opportunity to speak at this meeting or this hearing, you have it right now. Michelle, is there any objection to closing the meeting right now, the hearing?
We'll just give it one more minute. Everyone's had a chance to speak that wants to.
I would.
And do we have a full list of the attendees? I think we do, but
Yes.
okay, great.
We're all set on that.
Okay, and I think if there's no other comments, and I don't see any comments. Oh, someone said I would like to. Oh,
That was from earlier.
Still from earlier. Okay. So I think no one's posting any other comments in the chat indicating that they wanted to make any other comments, and I don't hear any other speakers. Again, written comments will be accepted through February 18th.
I'll pass that information on.
Okay, and thank you, Carolee and Judy, especially. I do appreciate your participation, and Joe, you as well.
Thank you for answering our questions.
Sure. Okay, Robin, so I think we're okay to close then.
You need a motion, folks. I get a motion to end the public hearing for tonight.
So moved.
And a second,
Second.
and a vote.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Mr. Parkin, vote.
Trustee Walshipski?
Yes.
Thank you.
And yes.